Settled, we're going to start. I hope everyone had some lunch, some strawberries. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Hannah Myers, Director of Policing and Public Safety for the Manhattan Institute. Welcome and thank you for coming to this lunch this afternoon. Working on criminal justice policy, there are many issues that every citizen has thoughts about from his or her own personal experience. Certainly, marijuana legalization is one of those issues. If you have been in a New York City playground recently, or crossing any given street on any given day, the presence of pot smoke and its density is striking. Our speakers today have far more in-depth knowledge of the complex and consequential issues around legalization, the stumbling blocks, the points of promise, and where we go from here. So first, I shall introduce today's fantastic moderator, and he will introduce the panelists and say more on the topic. Ross Douthat has been a New York Times opinion columnist, publishing twice weekly for almost a decade and a half. He is also a host on the weekly opinion podcast, Matter of Opinion. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger on its website. He's the author of several books, including The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, Privilege, Harvard and Education of the Ruling Class, The Decadent Society, and with Manhattan's own president, Reihan Salam, who is here today, Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. He is also the film critic for National Review. Last May, Ross published a New York Times column titled, Legalizing Marijuana is a Big Mistake. It garnered over 2,600 comments before the comment section was closed. So Ross, thank you for tackling this controversial and nuanced issue.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. In addition to that roster of dubious accomplishments, I am a friend of the Manhattan Institute. A friend of Reihan's, you might say. And it occurred to me that the last time I was here, I think was several years ago, I was moderating a panel on wokeness and political correctness in higher education. And one of the speakers was Vivek Ramaswamy. So before I introduce our panelists today, I want you to consider and judge for yourselves which of these gentlemen is poised to launch a long shot presidential campaign. And we can take that up afterwards. But in spite of those flattering words, like any good newspaper columnist, I am a dilettante and not an expert. And in spite of having, taken a strong position in that op-ed, I don't claim profound expertise in marijuana policy. The same is not true of the gentleman to my left, and I'll introduce them, I guess, moving from right to left. To my immediate left is Kevin A. Sabet. He's the president and CEO of Smart Approaches to Marijuana. He's an affiliate of Yale University's Institution for Social and Policy Studies and the medical school. I have to quote this. He was once dubbed by NBC News a prodigy of drug politics. And he has the interesting distinction of being the only bipartisan drug policy advisor to 3 U.S. presidential administrations. So in the Q&A, you can ask him how he survived in that kind of role. To his left is Jonathan Calkins, a professor of operations research at public policy at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College, where he specializes in systems analysis of problems pertaining to drugs, crime, terror, violence, and prevention. And he recently co-authored the second edition of his book, Marijuana Legalization, What Everyone, including everyone in this room, needs to know. Although I'm told that things are moving fast enough that there may need to be a third edition. And then in between these distinguished academics is Charles Fane Lehman, who's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, an internet controversialist, whose work on Substack helped inspire that column that I wrote, and he's also a 2023 and 24 Robert Novak Fellow with the Fund for American Studies, where he's working on a project or set of writing projects related to marijuana drug policy and other matters connected to this discussion. So that's a pretty distinguished set of qualifications for this conversation, and I assure you I truncated the really impressive bios that I have here. And I'm going to try and have a light touch as moderator and just sort of lean on these gentlemen for the discussion. But I wanted to open it up by asking Kevin, who very kindly volunteered, if you could give us a sort of general overview of where we stand with marijuana policy in America right now, the progress of state level legalization, maybe something about the differences between different state strategies, just so we sort of have a frame for the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Ross. And I want to thank the Manhattan Institute for hosting us, and my fellow panelists who are extremely distinguished in their own right. I always learn from both of them and follow their great work. So it's an honor to be on the stage with all of you. Yeah, marijuana policy is interesting. It's taken a very interesting sort of evolution since the sort of height of the counterculture in the 60s and 70s. The result of sort of that movement at that time was that a small handful of states, a little less than a dozen, decriminalized personal possession of marijuana. So big distinction. I think one takeaway is the distinction between policies. So when I say decriminalized, I do not mean the legalizing the sales. I mean decriminalizing the personal possession. Happened in about a dozen states in the 1970s and really ended in the late 1970s. Even President Carter at one point early on his administration endorsed decriminalization and then backtracked as he was coming to re-election and things were sort of shifting in the country. Obviously, the 1980s brought on a very different era in drug policy. So there was no state action in the 80s or early 90s on this, as we had the Just Say No era, and sort of obviously the crack issue came on board, which marijuana was lumped into as a drug, like other harmful drugs. And really, it was until the mid 1990s when the folks in the legalization movement got together and said, how do we change public opinion? This has been so anti-drug, what can we do? And around that time that they were thinking about it, they happened to meet a couple of billionaires from both the right and the left that kind of discovered marijuana later in life, a few of them, and really liked it and said, we want to legalize marijuana, but we know that the country won't go for it. So we got to come up with something. They did some focus groups, then came up with a term that was never used by the FDA or the medical establishment called medical marijuana. And they said, if we can get, basically, we're not going to get FDA approval. We already have FDA approval for marijuana pill, but that's not what we want. We want to legalize all marijuana for medicine. Let's do that on the state level. So they came, I lived in California at the time. They started with California and Arizona in 1996. And most people at that time said that will never happen. They'll never legalize it. Interestingly, every living US president, including at the time Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter, wrote a letter to the people of the state of California saying, do not legalize medical marijuana. It is a Trojan horse for legalization. It's a bad idea. The voters didn't listen. The commercials were very compelling. You had cancer patients and AIDS patients saying that this was helpful. And that started a wave. Today, we are still part of that, where now 38 states have legalized what they call medical marijuana. They differ slightly. Obviously, a state like Vermont is a little bit different than going to, the doctor with a bikini on in Venice Beach and getting a recommendation in California, for a hangnail or a headache. There are some differences. Generally, I would say they're very similar, though. It doesn't take a lot to qualify. It's not about extreme pain or late stage cancer. It's really, in most states, what everybody, like if you sleep less than 8 hours, that's considered a medical condition. So that's in 38 states. And then, of course, this was part of the plan to, it was medical first, and then let's get really our goal for full legalization. And that's now happened in about 22 states. And that's been happening since Colorado and Washington did that in 2012. I would argue most of those regimes are very similar. They follow a commercial model for legalization, which is similar to alcohol, where it's not like state-owned stores or anything like that. It's private industry. Interestingly, the last 5 out of the last 6 states to vote for legalization voted it down. Most of them Republican states, but still, it was interesting because Oklahoma, for example, has more medical marijuana dispensaries than Colorado, given the quirk in their law. And yet, after that, they that sort of turned Oklahoma voters off of marijuana versus what it had done in many of the other states, which was just kind of precipitate it, and they voted very harshly against it. So this is where we are state-wise. Federally, there's really been very little movement on marijuana. The Controlled Substances Act was 1970. That has not changed. The first piece of legislation federally on marijuana passed for the first time in 50 years last year. That was actually a piece of legislation my organization endorsed, which was a research piece, because there is a lot about today's sort of modern marijuana, the high potency stuff that we don't know about. And so there are reasons that you'd want to research that more. And so there's been no movement. President Biden was the only Democratic candidate to be very strongly against legalization. Obviously, he's the president now, and he hasn't changed his position. But in the last month, something happened for the first time in a very long time on this issue, where the Health and Human Services Department recommended to the Attorney General, who has the final say, to reschedule marijuana. So there are 5 schedules of drugs in this country, 1 to 5, and basically they differ in terms of what you call abuse potential, except Schedule 1 means there's no medical purpose. In other words, there's no FDA-approved medication, called marijuana. That's why marijuana has been Schedule 1. But HHS recommended Schedule 3, which I found very curious because there still isn't a medication just called marijuana. So I don't know how they got there, and their analysis is not public. But they transmitted to the AG that this is their recommendation, and the Attorney General will take, we don't know how long, to determine whether they should defer to that. If that happens, it's in some ways a middle ground. It's not legalized, but certainly the message will be sent that it's not as serious as we used to think it was.
And does that means that doctors can prescribe? What is the directive?
Yeah, normally it does mean doctors can prescribe because this would be a medical product. That's what's so strange. And actually, even the way though that this came out publicly in the news was rather odd. Normally, a scheduling recommendation would not be public. This is like internal sort of inside baseball and government. The fact that it was released at 4:20 p.m. on Twitter by the Department of Health and Human Services, I thought was, I guess trying to be funny, but it's the whole thing has been a little weird. I'll be honest with you. So I don't know where that's going to go.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate that overview. And now let's become more opinionated. And the open question that I'll just pose to each of you, starting with Professor Calkins, is how's it going?
It's a mixed bag, of course. The good news is kids, culture, and cool, and what's not happening for any of those. So I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's been analyzing this since 2009 in advance of California's Prop 17 and thinking about what are the surprises, good and bad. And back then, we really thought legalization would be very bad for kids, big increases in use. It has not been very bad. Kids are all right. It has not turned into a major culture war divide. If you turn back the clock to when the first propositions were being voted, highly controversial, polarizing, we as a society are almost like eager to jump on something to divide us, but this hasn't really become that. And cannabis is delightfully becoming a little bit boring. It used to be the cool hip thing. It's easing its way into being the middle-aged thing. And that's cool because I'd rather have something not used because it doesn't appeal than not used because it's banned. Now, on the negative side, there's a lot of negative things. It's been a spectacular drop in price. The price per gram has gone down by like 80%, and it's become much more potent. So the decline in price per milligram of THC has just soared. Along with that is a massive increase in intensity of use. Most people count how many people use. That's gone up. But the really big change is the intensity of use. Like it used to be only 1 in 10 current users reported daily or near daily, which is the same as alcohol and fits with something that's essentially a recreational drug, but some people have trouble with it. Now it's 40%. It's getting close to like tobacco. Daily use is the norm, and total milligrams of THC per day has gone way beyond, as Kevin said, the stuff that's been researched in the past, in part because this amazing proliferation of product forms. If you go back to 2009, it was marijuana, meaning a chunk of plant material that was smoked, And now it's edibles and dabs and vapes and CBD products and synthetic THC products. I draw the analogy to milk as opposed to the whole dairy industry. Back in 2009, marijuana was just one thing, more or less, like milk. And now we have a for-profit industry putting out a broad variety of products, all of which derive from the cannabis plant. And that, of course, increases the appeal. People who wouldn't want to smoke something can eat candy and gummy bears, for instance. So anyway, the short answer is a mixed bag, but I'm a professor, so I don't stop with short.
Do you, before we go, so the intensity of use you think is driven more by by sort of essentially capitalism, right? By varieties than it is by potency making people more addicted / desirous of continued use.
Yes, I just throw in there also the decline in price, the collapse in price per unit of THC, the enormous marketing cleverness. Yeah.
Okay, Charles.
Yeah, so the thing that I'd add to all of that is that it seems like the regulatory problem associated with legal marijuana is much harder than was initially predicted, or more precisely, commercialization produced the regulatory problems that were predictable, which is why when people like John were talking about how to legalize marijuana intelligently, they were often very skeptical of the commercialized model. Everybody in this room is mostly a resident of New York. Everybody in this room has walked past many, many marijuana stores on the streets of Manhattan. Essentially, none of those stores is licensed by New York State. There's something like 5 licensed dispensaries operating in the city of New York. This is a problem across legal jurisdictions. I think Colorado is the one that's doing it best. And off the top of my head, still something like 30% of sales in Colorado are in the gray market. In California, essentially none of the sales are happening in licensed stores. One of the big promises of legalization was that it would move sales out of the black market, which was claimed to be associated with violence and other crime, thereby depressing a source of profit for criminals, into this illicit, well-regulated, well-functioning market. And the effect is actually been the opposite. You've seen a couple of different things. One is that the original producers, i.e., in the American context, Mexican cartels, are substituting to other more deadly products because they can't make a lot of profit off of marijuana. But B, what we've actually done is created one highly regulated market, which, because of that regulation, is not comparatively attractive to consumers on price. And then a separate unregulated market that is not particularly enforced against is allowed to operate with impunity, and as a result draws all of the users, especially the heavy consumers, the people who are consuming daily large quantities of THC, because for people who consume in that volume with that frequency, price trumps all other concerns. So we sort of took all of the restraint away of prohibition, but then did not create regimes that were conducive to regulation. And now we're seeing exactly what you'd expect in such a market and addictive good.
Two questions on that. One, talk a little bit more about what drives the unregulated / gray market advantage on price. Is it just sort of they don't have to pass safety inspections? Why is it so much cheaper?
So at a bare minimum, it's that they don't have to comply with state regulations for things like safety, potency, whether or not they sell to kids. They don't have to adhere to the often minimal expectations of the bodies that oversee marijuana regulation. It's also the case that in some jurisdictions, here I'm talking about New York, but also soon my own state of Maryland, there are an additional set of expectations that have been imposed on top of the illicit market, where licenses, fees generated, etc., are diverted to diverted to benefit concerns of equity. By which I mean, so here in New York State, also soon to be in Maryland, initial licenses reserved for people who have been affected by marijuana prohibition. One can think this is noble. One can think this is not noble.
Weren't we all affected?
Yes,
Sorry.
possibly.
But the indirect effect of this is that you restrict the pool of people who are able to work in the market. By the way, you restrict the pool of people who are not necessarily the most competent vendors of marijuana, not the best at running businesses, and that ends up having an effect on your final cost. just like any other regulation would. So we have, bare compliance with regulations, but then everything else that we try to do with marijuana ends up being everything that we try to use the legal marijuana market for ends up being passed along to the consumer in some part in the form of higher prices, which exacerbates the problem.
Can I jump in for a minute
Yep.
to add something? It's wheelchair ramps. So let me explain this comment. So the industry says the reason we can't compete is because all of these cannabis specific excise taxes. Well, that does drive up the cost of business, but it's also, as Charles said, all of the things that all legal businesses have to do, like withhold payroll tax. And I say wheelchair ramps because I had this lovely interaction back in 2013 with a person who had been gray market. They were trying to move over to follow the rules under the new license regime. And the guy said, "It's killing me. I got to put wheelchair ramps into my greenhouses to comply with the ADA." So the industry blames it mostly on the taxes because those could plausibly be repealed. But frankly, it's just difficult to run a legal enterprise. And if we don't use law enforcement to make life difficult for the folks who don't have to comply with the rules, of course they would win. And so it's our fault. It's our fault for not for pretending that legalization means all law enforcement disappears, all arresting disappears. Legalization is almost the right time to ramp it up because when there's a legal market that can compete with the illegal market, you've got a better chance of driving the illegal. But we just failed. With the exception, Colorado did okay, Washington did okay. Many states, including California, failed.
Okay, for certain, relatively speaking, not
Relatively
necessarily in
speaking,
absolute
right. I'm
terms.
grading on a curve here.
Yeah.
Let's get into it. Kevin, go.
Well,
go
one thing I
ahead
was
and
just
then-
going to say, you brought up both you brought up great points, and I wanted to touch on something each of you said. One was about equity, and then one, John, about sort of how the kids are doing. I'm less optimistic about how the kids are doing right now. When obviously defines, we need to define what kid means, but when you look especially at young adults, or you really look at like 16 to 25, our brains obviously are developing now until 25, maybe 30. And critical 45 still going for some of us, and men are definitely later than women, clearly. But the point being that we are seeing just this word commercialization, just this extreme commercialization and promotion, really in all sectors of society that are affecting, especially young adults. I'm glad that they're not, starting earlier at age 9 or 10. But starting at 16, 17, 18, 19 is certainly, not something that I think we should pretend is a victory. I also see it connected to equity. When you look at surveys of children actually living in public housing, we have more kids now saying that they smell and see marijuana than they do tobacco, much more. And then than they ever have. And, these concerns about secondhand, thirdhand exposure is still a huge concern. In fact, study just came out saying secondhand marijuana smoke was something like 4 to 5 times worse given the carcinogens and hydrocarbons than tobacco smoke, which is shocking if you think about the regulations we have on tobacco and how, we sort of have come as a society to reject and stigmatize smoking, whereas we're going in the opposite way for marijuana. We also see more children of color and poorer kids using marijuana than they have in a very long time, and using it intensely. I think that term intensity does matter because there is a difference if somebody tries it once or twice a year, decides they don't really like it, and obviously a difference versus someone who's using it daily or near daily. And I have big concerns there. On equity, not only am I concerned about how something like this is regressive for poorer people, because if I started using marijuana when I was 16 and I got into trouble, I had a lot of the supports. Addiction is more than biology. It's environment and support. And so I'd have the support from my parents to send me if they needed to a very expensive treatment center, or the family support, the job opportunities that I would still get, that second chance that I would get. When you look at people who already dealt such a bad hand in life, and the idea that we think that they're going to have the same opportunity to rebound as someone like me, they're not. And you have now the tobacco industry, an industry that is not known for sort of truths and revealing, their whole hand when they know what their cards are and when they should do that. Now sort of investing, and they've invested billions, and taking over the marijuana industry, which really is, like, if you think about it, such a important thing to the counterculture. These are people who hated, sort of Wall Street and capitalism and these big corporations, and they started the whole marijuana, sort of campaign, I guess you could say 60 years ago, now sort of the very folks that they always despised are now in charge, and they're in it for money. And when you're in it for money, it's about addiction for profit. You have to promote heavy use. It's not a surprise that we have intensity of use. That's a part of this industry's playbook, that you need people to consume your product. You don't need everybody to consume it every day, but you need a big portion of society. You need them to start young. And actually, going to poor communities of color sometimes is a good business decision. And my worry is that, we have a lot of policymakers who just see this as like, I smoked a joint, it wasn't a big deal 50 years ago, so what's the big deal? And not really understanding the full implications. And we're not minting Black and Hispanic billionaires or millionaires either by legalizing marijuana, which is often promised. If you look at the campaigns in places like Baltimore and places like other parts of where there's a high sort of BIPOC population, part of the pitch is like, yes, this is about equity because you can now, become rich. You can prosper on this. That isn't happening anywhere. The people that are holding the money on this it's Wall Street folks, it's the hedge fund investors, it's big tobacco, big alcohol has taken a huge interest because they're seeing that a lot of people are drinking more when they're using marijuana. So that's a good thing for the alcohol industry. And so they're all getting involved. And it kills me when I hear about equity because it's certainly not happening.
So how does that corporate piece, sort of the rise of big cannabis, interact with the other points being made about how, small scale legal suppliers are struggling to compete with the black market? Is there money to be made from this? Does it just vary state to state, right? Like who's profiting? When we talk about big cannabis, right? What are we talking about, and where are they making money?
So if we're talking about big cannabis, in Canada, they have greenhouses that are 1 million square feet.
So we're talking about the Canadian menace. Fundamentally.
Sorry,
sorry,
I was talking about Canada's successful regulatory,
That's
cohesive
what I thought you were
federal
saying,
provincial approach. But the point is, when you don't have the chaos, there are economies of scale,
right?
And especially on the production side, it's natural for it to be done at large scale. So the image that legalization was going to be same old, just nobody's getting arrested, ignored the basic economics of production. And so all those people who imagined that they could earn a comfortable middle class lifestyle growing 100 or 1,000 plants were misguided. And related to Kevin's point, if you say, on equity grounds, I care about you so much, I give you the opportunity to sink all of your retirement savings into starting up a small business in a new industry that is experiencing waves of consolidation and mergers. Some people will get rich, but as in any new industry, 4 out of 5 or something like that are not going to be the winners.
But so like in New York State, right? New York State has sort of a very limited number of licensed, right? How many roughly?
Like 5 or 6.
There were statewide it's like 10.
It's like 10.
More have been approved and they're rolling them out slowly.
But so there's not a ton of big corporate money to be made in that legal.
Well, not yet.
Yeah. So one of the weird things about this whole topic is at present, we have these separate state fiefdoms, and that will disappear with national legalization because the Interstate Commerce Clause is going to force it to be a national market.
Right.
And then I don't really know any reason why marijuana should be grown in New York at all, in Arkansas or someplace like that. If you take hops as a useful analogy, like all the hops for all the beer in the country are grown in Idaho. It just will concentrate wherever it makes sense too. And these state-specific production regimes will go away.
But the point that John raised a minute ago about really the scale of growth is, I think, important to actually a point that he's made previously, because and I like his phrasing, which is simply to observe that the thing about weed is that it's a weed. It's not actually that hard to grow, which means that most of the costs of marijuana to the end user, this is again John's point, most of the costs of marijuana to the end user come from prohibition. They come from the costs associated with getting it to the street under the terms of prohibition. And so in the long run, we should expect the amount of profit available in the industry to decline quite rapidly because the actual costs of growing huge quantities of marijuana and then delivering it are very small. So I think in the short run, there are sort of profits to be garnered by big tobacco, and those entities will consolidate and consume many of the small growers. But in the long run, you'll see what you see in things like the hops industry, and this is relevant to another sort of argument advanced for marijuana legalization in particular, which is the expected tax revenues associated with legalization, have been in most legalization states relatively anemic. In the state of Oregon, their new drug treatment system or their new funding for drug treatment is supposed to be funded by revenues from the state marijuana tax fund. Over a certain threshold, and they haven't been getting any money out of it. It's been a huge problem for the efforts to provide drug treatment for the state in the country with the largest unmet demand. It is one of the key articles of faith is this is a way to deal with state deficits, to close pension holes. And the reality is, in the long run, it's not going to do that. It's not going to provide that. You'll just sort of have consolidation to leech what profit you can out of an intrinsically not that hard to grow substance.
Does that kind of consolidate in a national market with a few big producers? Does that make legal marijuana more competitive with black market marijuana? And related to that, is the issue with the black market just that it is so mature and developed? Like, because we don't have a huge black market in cigarettes and alcohol, right? There is a black market, but it's not. Is it just the problem of we had this market for so long, it functions, it just continues to function? Is that what keeps the black market going?
Well, there's a bunch of reasons. One is the absence yet of real national brands. Right? So part of what makes people pay for whether it's tobacco or alcohol is the marketing and the brand. And at present, these still relatively small state-specific entities have mostly not succeeded in achieving the kind of brand recognition that Marlboro or Bud have. I think that by 10 years after national legalization, with enough marketing, that will make a difference. Like a useful metaphor is we say, oh, it's like tobacco or alcohol because they're addictive, but marijuana is also a lot like bottled water, like what you're drinking right there. Because the production costs are so cheap, the real way to make money is the way that Evian does it. They somehow convince you to spend $2 or $3 for a bottle of something that's functionally identical to what you get for free out of the tap. And so I do think there's economies of scale also in the marketing and the creation of a brand and getting people to pay much more than it actually costs you to produce it.
And this discussion about price greatly relates to public health, which we haven't talked as much about. But when, obviously we know that drug users are sensitive to price. We know that for alcohol. That's why the alcohol industry has been so successful in making sure that our taxes are pretty low when it comes to alcohol. It's why the tobacco industry resisted for decades for increases until they were basically threatened with prohibition or an increase in tax. And so they took the latter. Because people are sensitive to that, and all kinds of people. I mean, even if you're, a heavy user, you're sensitive to price. And when the price goes down, which I think it's really universally agreed to that that's happening and will continue to happen, and will happen even more with national legalization. You have more use and you have more users. And what we're learning now about the marijuana that is out there, that is the typical marijuana being used, and the way people are using it with the intensity. I think, again, if more people knew about it, would give us pause on the sort of grand experiment. When you look at the connection, for example, with poor mental health outcomes, specifically schizophrenia, psychosis, but also depression, anxiety, and even suicide. Colorado now is the #1 marijuana, and most legal states. This wasn't the case before legalization. Marijuana is the #1 drug found in folks that died by suicide who are under the legal age to buy marijuana. Now, is that all because of legalization? You can ask the question, was it sort of chicken and egg, like which came first? Maybe there was always that culture, but we hadn't seen that before. And when you look at that, when you look at learning, when you look at the studies on IQ reduction, memory, cardiovascular. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that it's very hard for baby boomers to fathom because the marijuana that was being used and smoked when they were in college and high school was just way less potent. The effects were far less. We didn't see 500,000 people like we do now, for example, every year going to the emergency room because of an acute psychotic break resulting from recent use of marijuana. That just wasn't the case before. So I think there's just a lot the divide between sort of what scientists and researchers who have been doing this a long time kind of know and what everyone else knows, I don't think has ever been greater. And that is directly related to these policies because when you have a commercial regime that lowers the price and then obviously advertises, hires celebrities, really all the things that big tobacco did, downplay the harms that are out there in the literature, fund lobbyists. You should see the lobbyists we're up against in Washington D.C. with for anyone from the Bankers Association to the alcohol lobby to the marijuana's own lobby. It's pretty enormous what legalization does. So I think a lot of people think we're not going to arrest people, but it's so much more than that.
Well, and on that note, and maybe you guys can talk a little bit about, you mentioned Colorado and Washington as maybe distinct. Are there just generally, are there states that have done this better than others? And two, is there a model out there of decriminalization without commercialization? Because that was, as a sort of casual follower of these debates, that seemed to be sort of promised as a sweet spot by at least some people 10 or 15 years ago.
I want these two to comment on that, but I would say the model just quickly on that would be speed limits or jaywalking. It should be something we do not encourage, that we actually discourage people from speeding. But if you are speeding, unless you're sort of way above, but most people, or if you happen to be caught for jaywalking, your life isn't destroyed. You can't it's not like you're not going to be able to access housing, healthcare, education, just be thrown in jail. But it is something as a society that we're discouraging, even if people are doing it. I mean, most people who speed, by the way, they don't get into a car crash. It's not a reason to get rid of speed limits. But so I think those, for me, it's that kind of model. And I haven't seen one state doing it really particularly that well.
Well, and I think I think the question about marijuana models, non-commercial models, is a really interesting one in the American context. I mean, so Alaska had its sort of short run experiment with you can grow your own, but that wasn't really commercially legal, imposed by judicial fiat, which is arguably preferable. And there were sort of proposals in the early days of legalization or discussion of legalization about I'm fond of the late drug policy scholar Mark Kleinman's proposal, where you have a national registry of people who can use marijuana, and you can only access it through the mail, and you only get a certain amount. And what I like about that is Kleinman, he's thinking very seriously about how do you balance the equities, how do you minimize harm, maximize benefit, and also that was never going to happen in the United States. Like, we don't do that stuff here. There are other countries who have relatively successful regimes for other countries who decriminalized all drugs relatively, could have gone much worse, which have sort of partial legalization models or grow your own models, or go back and forth with the coffee houses in Amsterdam, but doesn't seem like the end of the world. But I think it is important that in the American context, there were people who talked about this as an idea, and then it never happened. We Americans are one of the reasons that we're a great country, in my opinion. I can say it's the Manhattan Institute, is because we have a deeply commercial spirit. We believe in free enterprise. That's part of what makes us wealthy and rich and successful. And also it means that we don't really know how to go halfway on commercialization of addictive, damaging substances.
As long as we're here, let's take this one step farther. What is so massively wonderful about free markets? They are fantastic when consumers make good decisions for maximizing their own welfare. I know better than the government what kind of breakfast cereal I want to have in the morning. But with addictive substances, 80% of the consumption is by daily and near daily users, and a substantial portion of them are harming themselves with their choices. And so that power of the free market is not so wonderful if it is a good or service that people make bad decisions about. So my favorite models are blood and Spain. So think about the market for blood donation in the United States. We don't primarily do that through the government. but we also don't let IBM and Exxon draw people's blood and sell it to hospitals. That's done by the American Red Cross, which is a nonprofit which has as its mission and reason for existing serving the public welfare, not maximizing profit. So that's the blood model. Spain, I think, actually has a pretty good approach where they say you can do more than grow for yourself, because not everybody is good at growing things. They allow small groups of 20 to 30 people to form a little cooperative that can pool those growing rights. And if Kevin is the best farmer amongst the 20 or 30 people, he gets to grow for all of us and can sell to us at cost. So he doesn't make any money. And he also doesn't make vapes and dabs and all sorts of other products, because that requires a scale economy that Kevin growing for 20 or 30 people doesn't get. So that's another approach to having supply that can compete with the illegal market without bringing the for-profit side in.
Just very briefly, I think, there's the European comparison to the American political context is really important, because I'm sympathetic to that as an approach, and also, as Kevin has alluded to, there are people spending millions and millions of dollars in DC to make sure that does not happen in the United States, and in state legislatures to make sure that does not happen in the United States. My favorite example of this is Oregon, which recently decriminalized small possession. If you talk to people who are advocates of Oregon's decrim program, they'll say we want to do exactly what they do in Portugal, where small possession is also decriminalized.
Of
And-
everything, of every drug.
Of every drug, not just marijuana. And the response is, okay, so in Portugal, you have universal treatment on demand. You have that in Oregon. They go, no, we don't really have the capacity for that. They say in Portugal, if you're caught using drugs in public, you are brought before a commission of dissuasion, and they strongly they ask you about your drug use. If it's problematic, they strongly encourage you to consider treatment. Or do you going to have commissions of dissuasion? They go, no, that's not really in line with what culture is like in the state of Oregon. We just don't really feel like that was appropriate for. It's like,
That's the whole model.
that's the whole model.
Yeah.
So my point is, not only do we seem unable to adopt these sort of half measures, we also have political and economic actors who have an active interest in us not adopting these half measures.
Absolutely.
Well, and on that, we're going to take questions in 1 second. But for my last moderator's privilege question, just for any of you, talk about the politics of this, because there's sort of a presumption in this discussion that we will have federal legalization at some point. Given polling on this question, that seems like a fair presumption. The numbers on marijuana, as far as I can see, look like the numbers on same-sex marriage, just this really strong swing to about 60-30 in favor of legalization. That doesn't seem to have changed much in the last 5 years. Is there any other but with the proviso that the leader of the Democratic Party, the president of the United States, doesn't want to go that far. A lot of Republican politicians clearly don't want to go that far. There is sort of more political opposition among politicians than you would expect, maybe both from those 60-30 polls and from all that lobbying. So is there any other political future besides a 10-year path to legalization, let's say?
So we've been promised like federal legalization especially from promoters of legalization, that this should have happened 20 years ago. Then it was no, it'll happen in 2001. Then it was 2010. Mark Kleinman famously said a late second term of Hillary Clinton. So there have been predictions. There have been a lot of predictions.
Still waiting for that one.
Yeah, that haven't come to pass. I guess that's still possible. I guess.
It is.
But
She's thinking it.
but the reality is, I think digging deeper into the polling is interesting, because I think the polling on this issue has been fairly unsophisticated by most of the national pollsters, who sort of like a Pew that asked this question, or Gallup. In that, it's really just asking, do you want to legalize marijuana use? And a lot of people interpret that question. There's many ways to interpret that question. And you can interpret it as, I'm an adult and I want to smoke a joint in my backyard or in my house, my basement. You can interpret that question as, we want to treat it like alcohol. I want to see it in the corner. You can interpret it as, we're going to sort of sell it, but we're going to restrict it and discourage it like cigarettes. So the main question on this that folks follow with the Gallup question, I think has been very problematic. They won't change the question because they have longitudinal data on it. We tried to have them change it, or at least get more sophisticated. It's not really in their interest to do that. When we've asked Emerson Polling and some other very, top end pollsters to dig into this, when they make a distinction between decriminalizing use or allowing adults to use in private, versus sort of legal sales versus medical only, there is a lot more variation. So that's one caveat. The second caveat is the same people that say yes to legalization, 75% of them say no to legalization in my community. So when you ask them, okay, you're cool with it state-wise, but can we open a pot shop in your, community, in your city? 75% of them say, no, that's not really what I was getting at. Like, do it over there, or let's figure out another way to do it.
Keep it all in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Yeah,
That
pretty
seems- that
much.
seems-
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of nuance to the polling and the public opinion that usually it's not in the interest of the legalization lobby to point out that nuance, or in the sort of pro marijuana politicians. From a long-term point of view, I mean, I think it's just very difficult to predict. We don't have a crystal ball. I mean, you could say so many states have done it that there's a tipping point now that you have about half the country. So there's going to have to be some action. I don't know. What's interesting is if the FDA indeed says, all right, this isn't our purview now, there's one direction they could theoretically go, which is, all right, they're going to treat it like tobacco. They're going to put heavy regulations. It's sort of like, be careful what you wish for. Right now, you can get away with having 4 pot shops on this block. If FDA is in charge, there's going to be very stringent. But I would take maybe more cynical view to think, I'm not sure that they would really exercise that enforcement or want to do that in an environment where it's so accepted. And I think that even if there was some sort of federal takeover, I'm not sure how different a lot would be, because this is kind of an issue where if you ask the Biden people, you ask people at the White House, you ask top Democratic and Republican leadership, other than Chuck Schumer, who has taken this on as like an issue of his, they're just honestly in private, it's like they're sick of it. Like, this is not an important issue. Like, I have 25 other issues that most people are really interested in. This is like this sideshow. Now, some, like I would say the majority leader, have said, well, this helps get me votes, so I am actually going to take this on as a serious thing. But I think for most politicians, it's not something they want to spend a lot of brain power on or time.
Yeah. All right. I'm sure there's more to be said, but let's do a couple questions in the time we have. But yes, let's thank our panelists once. So there's a mic, and yes, ma'am, in the 4th row. Red.
Hi, thank you so much, Manhattan Institute, for doing this. Professor, you mentioned at the beginning that it's sort of been okay for the kids, and I know Kevin pushed back on that a little bit, but doesn't the data tell you that smoking of marijuana cigarettes is down, but the vaping of marijuana is up in a very big way? And I guess secondly, I don't know if anyone saw this, but Barry Weiss in her Free Press this past week published an article written by a 16-year-old in California who started smoking at 12 during COVID, and says basically, like, I know and all my peers know that it's addictive. It's those, baby boomers that have no clue.
Well, so first, I think your stats are right. And I will also say, whatever has happened through 2023 doesn't tell us what will happen through 2043. So one of the frustrations for me is people think that you can assess legalization by what's happened so far. I think the evolution of how this plays out is hard to predict. And that whole question about whether it is smoked or vaped, and how the legalization of cannabis affects whether or not nicotine addicts smoke or vape, is actually a pretty big potatoes issue too. But your quote of that, was it 16-year-old? That captures a little bit what I meant. Why it's not as cool. It's not as much of a young person's thing. It is more of a young adult and middle age thing. So she's absolutely right. The heaviest use is in the 20s and 30s, and that's so I worry about that more than some people. So some people think kids, vulnerable, adults, no problem. I'm actually a little bit worried about both categories of users, but I'm kind of optimistic when the young people say that the middle-aged people don't get it about this.
Let's take another. Sure, right here.
this is a quintessentially libertarian issue if I ever heard one, because they used to say coffee and I think tea were corruptors of youth way back. Okay. But do you consider this more a problem of government inadequacy and dysfunction or the behavior itself?
I think all of it, I would say.
Well, gotcha.
I mean, so there are intrinsic harms, like any addictive substance. There are intrinsic harms to marijuana use that are not evenly distributed in the population. Something like 80% or more of your use is going to be concentrated in 20% or fewer of your users. Are those people going to die? Probably not. Are they potentially going to suffer substantial psychological effects? Yeah. Even bracketing that, are they going to suffer from the usual deprivations of addiction? Yeah, it's a serious risk. Part of the reason that I suspect the 16-year-old, what she's identifying is that some of her peers are addicted to marijuana and their lives are substantially worse for that. That's not even necessarily the problem of use so much as intrinsic to the substance. That said, we have comparatively successful regimes of legalized consumption of addictive goods. Maybe that's not ideal, but that's where we're at as a country. We tried banning alcohol. We decided we didn't like it. Now we have a legalized regime of alcohol consumption, which is problematic in many regards, but exists. It is theoretically possible for governments to design successful regulatory regimes for addictive goods. Sometimes they're even worth all the costs associated with it. One of my assertions is that we seem particularly bad at doing this in the United States for reasons that I think are intrinsic and structural, and are not just about the character of America, but also about the way in which we do governance in the United States. That we tend to be more decentralized, that we tend to be more hands-off, that we have what what's sometimes referred to as weak states, or weak state. That yields a lot of benefits for us, but also it means that in dealing with these sort of nitty-gritty, John once proposed the ideal solution for marijuana for marijuana price setting was to have a central board that was responsible for determining what the price should and should not, what the tax level should and should not be. And like you can imagine countries where you can do that, and we are not a country where you can have that institution.
Sir in the bow tie.
Thank you very much for your
You're on. We can hear you.
Thank you very much for your comments. One subject you have not touched upon is driving under the influence and the absence of a test.
Well, it's a huge issue because we don't have yet at least a roadside test like we do alcohol, like a breathalyzer. The alcohol, of course, is 0.08 in most states or 0.05 now. Of course, that's not purely scientific either. There are plenty of people who drive fine above 0.08 and plenty of people who don't drive fine, in other words, inebriated under that. But that's kind of a level that as a society we've said, oh, we're good with that. I don't think we were anywhere near that for marijuana. Law enforcement has tried to hire specialized officers. You can't imagine that as a long-term solution to bring to scale, that every single time you have a suspected person driving, you're going to call in a separate officer to be able to do a behavioral test.
The ACO would never tolerate that.
Yeah, so I think it's a huge conundrum. What we have seen, and you could say whether legalization did this or not, or whether they just happen to have marijuana in the system, maybe they weren't really impaired. But when you ask law enforcement agencies in legalized states, almost universally, we are seeing people who have had near fatal or fatal crashes have had much higher levels of marijuana in their system, or just tested positive for marijuana since they had these lax laws. Are they, again, you could say it's not related. You could say that they were, looking at their phone, but they also happen to have marijuana in their system and it was really their phone that did it. Those are very difficult to disentangle. But I do think that the driving issue is a big conundrum and question mark. We have not been able to get near the answers we should, given how bad of a problem it is.
So I agree with everything that Kevin just said, except take the word "yet" out. There's actually some biological, neuropsychological reasons why it's not just a technical problem that's going to be solved soon. There's a low correlation between THC content in your blood and impairment. So it's not like we just need to get some tech firm to do the technological breakthrough. It's fundamentally different than alcohol at the molecular level. So we probably won't have a good test for impairment. Correct.
Let's do two more, sir, in the beard.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, hold on. We'll just wait for the mic. Sorry.
It sounds like, I'm not sure if this
Yeah.
is, there we go. It sounds like we're circling around limitations on potency as maybe being the thing to work with here. And I mean, I hear the argument that we're bad at half measures, but we have limits on nicotine, alcohol, pesticides, preservatives, additives, supplements. So why not this one too?
If you can find a way for us to do it successfully, let us know, because we have been working with almost every state and the folks who you would think would be aligned with us and sort of groups. A lot of this is what Charles goes back to what Charles was saying. Fundamentally, is a culture and political problem where getting something like this passed is very, very difficult to have that. Now, John may have a reason why we should or shouldn't do those limits, but if you agree, like, let's sell 10% potent products. By the way, Amsterdam, which has now banned the sales of most marijuana products within the red light district, by the way, which is very interesting. They have been really promoting and pushing a 15% cap. Think about that versus you can go within 5 minutes and buy something that has 99.9%, they claim, THC in a concentrate. You're right. It should be a no-brainer that we don't really need 99.9%, or we don't really need above 30% even, or flower above 20%. That has just been politically, as we've been trying to do, it's been impossible. From a political point of view.
Why?
Because the pushback, well, the pushback
Who
you
is-
get, well, the industry. I mean, the industry and their lobbyists, you get such huge pushback on many levels. First of all, for somebody using marijuana daily, it's true, 10% won't do much for them. 15% probably won't do much for them. And so there is a market for that. They still want to get high. Marijuana does produce a tolerance, does produce a withdrawal. So it's, if you're a regular user for 30 years and you're using every day, you are going to want something higher, and there are arguments to be made. Oh, well, then, Kevin, the underground market then will come and fill that gap. If you limit it 10%, they'll sell it over here for 15%. There are a lot of sort of these arguments politically that are pushed.
Yeah, and then there's this idiot professor from Carnegie Mellon who will disagree
Yeah, I
with
know.
half of what you said, but then get on board for the second half. I don't want a 15% THC cap on flower, because then people just smoke twice as many grams and they get twice as many carcinogens. So I actually don't really support a cap on THC of flower. But Quebec in Canada has banned all of the extract-based
Right.
products, the vapes and the dabs, and that has succeeded.
Yeah.
And they have lower rates of use of those products. So I would do that very happily, but I actually wouldn't do a ban on the THC content of the flower.
All right, let's.
Oh, I'm sorry, the
Smokable.
old-fashioned smokable kind of
smoked
stuff.
marijuana.
Traditional,
marijuana, I
traditional.
know.
1.0.
It's a wonderful word, isn't it?
All right, let's take one more question and then we'll wrap up. Maybe someone in the back, since I've been calling on people in the front. Yes, sir.
Thank you. This was a great talk. I just do want to preface that I am an open pot smoker. I feel it's important to have people state that. But I did have a question, which is, you still cannot mail marijuana, even in states where it's legal. When the marijuana goes to Schedule 3, would that be possible? And or what would make it possible? And I would imagine that would have a significant impact, especially on these small stores, which are convenient if you could order in the mail. Like, what do you see? Would that change the industry?
Okay, so after it's in Schedule 3, if the product does meet FDA good manufacturing practices, is approved, is prescribed, it could be mailed the same way your antibiotic prescription could be mailed, which probably means almost none of where the market is, because most of the market won't go through that. But if we look forward to just straight national legalization of the non-medical product, I think those bricks and mortar dispensaries are toast. They're going to be roadkill, because their cost per transaction is very, very high. And direct mail order delivery to the house, or just having it sold at a grocery store or a convenience store, is a much lower cost per transaction distribution model. So don't buy stock in the retail outlets.
But even if it's made Schedule 3, don't hold your breath that it will be mailable anytime soon, because again, that's assuming there's a FDA approved product. And again, there's
Which-
a lot is unknown, but we don't have that yet. So that takes a while.
All right. On that note, I'd invite you to join me in
Thank you.
thanking our panelists for a terrific conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe not a fully optimistic conversation. but,
And thank you to
It's
our moderator. Thank
2023.
you, Ross.
Yeah, thank
you,
Ross.
Ross.
Thank you. It was fun.
yeah,
Thanks a lot.
thank you. Great. You guys were great.